The morning sun cast long shadows across Harvard Yard as Ibrahim Traoré stepped out of the black sedan. His simple, military fatigues stood in stark contrast to the ivy-covered buildings surrounding him. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks ago, a rare honor for an African leader to address the global leadership summit. Students whispered in clusters, their phones already capturing his arrival. The weight of history pressed against his shoulders as he walked the same paths once tread by presidents and Nobel laureates. Today he would speak not just as Burkina Faso's leader, but as Africa's voice. Inside the grand auditorium, 500 of the world's brightest minds filled the mahogany seats. Diplomats, professors, and business leaders from 6 continents had gathered for this unprecedented event. The chandeliers above seemed to judge every word before it was spoken. Ibrahim noticed the subtle divisions. African attendees clustered together, isolated from the main discussions. The program listed him last after presentations on modern democracy and economic development models. He sensed the underlying message. Africa would be heard, but only when the real speakers were finished. Dr. Margaret Chun, the summit coordinator, approached with nervous energy crackling around her. President Traoré, we're honored to have you here, she said, her handshake firm but brief. Your 15-minute slot comes after Professor Wittmann's keynote on sustainable governance. The time limit stung. Other speakers had been given 30 minutes minimum. She glanced at her watch with academic precision. The audience is particularly eager to hear your perspective on challenges facing developing nations. The careful praising revealed everything about how they viewed his homeland. As Ibrahim took his designated seat in the front row, he felt the familiar fire building in his chest. This wasn't just about speaking to Harvard's elite. It was about dismantling decades of condescension with truth. The introductory speakers droned on about theories and statistics, never mentioning the real people behind the data. He thought of the farmers in Ouagadougou, the students in Boso, the mothers in Banora. Today, their stories would echo through these hallowed halls. The revolution had come to Harvard. Professor Harrison Wittmann III adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and surveyed the auditorium with practiced superiority. At 63, he had built his reputation on economic theories about failed states and underdeveloped societies. His latest book, The Burden of Governance, topped bestseller lists across Western universities. Students hung on his every word, treating his opinions as gospel truth. The Harvard Economics Department had elevated him to almost mythical status among academic circles. He viewed today's summit as another opportunity to showcase his intellectual dominance over lesser minds. As he reviewed his notes, backstage, Wittmann's assistant whispered updates about the African president in attendance. Some military upstart on Burkina Faso. He muttered dismissively, not bothering to learn Ibrahim's name. His speech would focus on why African leaders consistently failed their people through corruption and incompetence. The irony was lost on him, speaking about Africa without ever truly listening to Africans. His PowerPoint slides were filled with charts showing GDP failures and democracy rankings. He had never set foot on African soil, yet considered himself an expert on its problems. Walking onto the stage, Wittmann commanded attention with his tailored suit and confident stride. The audience offered polite applause as he began his presentation on sustainable governance in emerging economies. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in every room. Within minutes, he was dissecting African leadership failures with surgical precision. Each statistic he quoted painted a picture of incompetence and backwardness. His smugness grew with every nod of agreement from his academic peers. 20 minutes into his presentation, Wittmann noticed Ibrahim sitting calmly in the front row. Something about the young African leader's steady gaze unsettled him, though he couldn't pinpoint why. The man showed no reaction to the indirect criticisms being hurled at his continent. Instead of the expected defensiveness, Ibrahim's face held an expression of patient observation. Wittmann felt compelled to be more direct, to provoke some reaction. From this silent figure, the professor's ego demanded acknowledgement of his intellectual superiority, especially from those he considered beneath his station. Professor Wittmann concluded his presentation with a flourish, clicking to his final slide about leadership, accountability. The applause was polite, but enthusiastic, exactly what he expected from his academic peers. As the moderator opened the floor for questions, Wittmann's eyes locked onto Ibrahim once again. Something about the African leader composed silence had been gnawing at him throughout his entire speech. He decided this was the perfect moment to assert his intellectual dominance publicly. The auditorium fell silent as Wittmann prepared to speak again. Before we move to the next speaker, Wittmann announced, his voice cutting through the hushed atmosphere, I feel compelled to address the elephant in the room regarding African leadership failures. His gaze fixed directly on Ibrahim, making his target unmistakably clear to everyone present. The audience shifted, uncomfortably sensing the tension building in the prestigious hall. We have here today someone who embodies exactly the kind of governance challenges I've been discussing. Student phones began recording as the confrontation escalated beyond academic discourse. The moderator looked panicked, unsure how to intervene in this unexpected public attack. Wittmann's voice grew louder and more condescending with each word he spoke. Perhaps instead of attending Harvard summits, you should go back to Burkina Faso and fix your own house first. The words hung in the air like a physical slap across Ibrahim's face. Gasps echoed throughout the auditorium as the insult registered with the stunned audience. Several African diplomats rose from their seats, their faces showing shock and outrage. The professor stood smugly behind his podium, seemingly pleased with his inflammatory declaration. Even his supporters looked uncomfortable with the blatant disrespect he had just displayed. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of shifting chairs and whispered conversations. Ibrahim remained seated, his expression unchanged, though his knuckles had whitened slightly as he gripped his chair. The moderator fumbled with her microphone, desperately trying to restore order to the chaos Wittmann had created. Cameras captured every angle of the humiliation, already preparing to broadcast this moment worldwide. The professor basked in what he believed was his intellectual victory over the African leader. He had no idea he had just awakened a force that would reshape everything. Ibrahim felt the weight of 500 pairs of eyes upon him as the professor's words echoed through the auditorium. His heart pounded against his ribs, not from fear, but from a familiar surge of righteous anger. This was the moment that defined leaders. Would he respond with emotion or with the calculated precision of a revolutionary? The silence stretched endlessly, each second carrying the hopes of every African in that room. He thought of his ancestors who had faced similar humiliations under colonial rule. Today, he would choose dignity over anger, truth over retaliation. The moderators' frantic attempts to move forward were met with an audience frozen in anticipation. Some attendees whispered frantically, while others sat transfixed by the unfolding drama before them. Ibrahim slowly rose from his chair, his movement deliberate and controlled like a predator preparing to strike. The simple act of standing seemed to command more respect than Wittmann's entire presentation. His military bearing spoke of battles fought and won, of a man forged in real struggle. The professor's smug expression began to waver as he realized his target was not retreating. Dr. Chun, Ibrahim's voice, cut through the chaos with calm authority that silenced every whisper. I believe I was allocated 15 minutes to speak to this distinguished gathering. His accent carried the musical rhythms of more mixed with perfect French, influenced English. The moderator nodded, eagerly, grateful for any opportunity to restore order to her summit. I would like to use that time now, if you don't mind. His request was polite, but something in his tone suggested it wasn't really a request. The auditorium held its collective breath, sensing they were about to witness something extraordinary. As Ibrahim walked toward the podium, Professor Wittmann reluctantly stepped aside, though his arrogance prevented him from leaving the stage entirely. The two men stood side by side, the pampered academic and the battle-tested leader. Ibrahim adjusted the microphone with the confidence of someone who had addressed nations. He looked out at the sea of faces, seeing past their prejudices to their humanity. This would not be a speech. It would be a reckoning. The next 15 minutes would either vindicate Wittmann's insults or expose them as the ignorance they truly were. Ibrahim stood at the podium, his hands resting gently on the wooden surface as he surveyed the audience. The overhead lights cast a warm glow on his face, revealing not anger but a profound sadness. He took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the silence work in his favor as tension filled every corner of the auditorium. Professor Wittmann shifted uncomfortably beside him, suddenly aware that he might have underestimated his target. The audience leaned forward collectively, sensing they were about to witness something unprecedented. Ibrahim's composure was not weakness. It was the calm that precedes a hurricane. Ladies and gentlemen, Ibrahim began, his voice carrying a richness that commanded immediate attention without raising volume. I want to thank Professor Wittmann for his enlightening perspective on African leadership. The slight pause before enlightening carried more weight than any shout could have conveyed. His eyes swept across the room, making contact with faces from every continent represented. His invitation for me to go back to Burkina Faso has given me a perfect opportunity. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the audience as they began to sense his tactical approach. The professor's face had lost its smugness, replaced by growing uncertainty. Ibrahim removed a folded piece of paper from his breast pocket, not notes, but a photograph. He held it up briefly before placing it on the podium, visible to the front rows. This is a picture of my grandmother taken in 1960 during our independence celebration. His voice carried the weight of generations as he spoke about the woman who raised him. She taught me that when someone shows you who they are, you should listen carefully. The personal touch immediately shifted the atmosphere from academic debate to human storytelling. Several audience members craned their necks to see the photograph. The auditorium had transformed from a place of intellectual discourse to a courtroom where truth would be the final judge. Ibrahim's measured breathing and steady gaze suggested he was about to deliver something far more powerful than anger. Professor Wittmann fidgeted with his notes, realizing his casual insult had unleashed forces beyond his comprehension. The cameras continued rolling, but now they were capturing history rather than just academic proceedings. Ibrahim smiled slightly, not with Malice, but with the confidence of someone holding all the right cards. The storm was about to break, and Harvard would never be the same. Professor Wittmann suggests I should return to Burkina Faso. Ibrahim began, his voice gaining strength. With each word, let me tell you about the Burkina Faso you clearly know nothing about. He gestured toward the photograph on the podium, his grandmother's weathered face, visible to the front rows. This woman lived through French colonial rule, watched her language forbidden in schools, her culture dismissed as primitive. The audience sat transfixed as Ibrahim painted a picture of systematic oppression, disguised as civilization. Yet she taught me that knowledge flows both ways if you're humble enough to receive it. Ibrahim's eyes found the African diplomats in the audience, drawing strength from their encouraging nods. My homeland sits on some of the world's richest gold deposits, yet we were told we were poor. His voice carried the weight of historical injustice without a trace of victimhood. We fed cotton to European textile mills, while our people wore rags made elsewhere. Professor Wittmann shifted uncomfortably as the room's energy began to turn against him. Our ancestors built the University of Sonker in Timbuktu when Harvard was still a European dream. The silence was deafening as this historical truth settled over the prestigious auditorium. You speak of governance failures, professor, but ignore the context that created them. Ibrahim's tone remained respectful yet firm, demonstrating the very leadership qualities Wittmann had dismissed when colonial powers drew arbitrary borders through our communities, dividing families and tribes. Did they consider governance? The question hung in the air like an accusation, though Ibrahim's delivery remained scholarly. When they installed puppet leaders and extracted our resources for centuries, was that sustainable development? Several students were frantically taking notes, realizing they were receiving an education their textbooks had never provided. But I did not come here to dwell on the past. Ibrahim continued, his voice rising with controlled passion. I came to speak about the future we are building despite your low expectations. The yaw was directed specifically at Wittmann, making the professor squirm visibly on stage. We have reduced poverty by increasingly pale face. You have written extensively about African corruption, professor, yet remain silent about Swiss banks hiding our stolen wealth. The accusation landed with surgical precision, causing murmurs to ripple through the distinguished audience. Your theories about failed states conveniently ignore which institutions enable that failure for profit. Several Western diplomats shifted uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing the uncomfortable truth being spoken. Tell me, how many Harvard endowment funds benefit from companies that extracted African resources without fair compensation? The question hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. You speak of democracy while supporting dictators who served Western interests for decades. Ibrahim's voice carried the authority of someone who had lived through the consequences of such policies. Your government sold weapons to oppressive regimes while lecturing us about human rights in academic papers. The hypocrisy was laid bare for all to see, stripping away the moral high ground Western academia claimed. We watch your universities celebrate diversity while your foreign policies create the very refugees you later reject. Professor Wittmann's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, unable to formulate a response. The room's energy had completely shifted from academic discourse to moral reckoning. Your economic models assume we are children who cannot manage our own resources. Ibrahim's words cut through decades of paternalistic thinking that had dominated international relations. Yet When we try to process our own gold, your sanctions appear overnight. The audience began to understand they were witnessing the dismantling of intellectual colonialism in real time. When we seek fair trade agreements, we are told we lack the expertise to negotiate. His voice grew stronger with each revelation, exposing the systematic undermining of African sovereignty. But when we succeed despite your obstacles, suddenly we are threats to global stability. I find it curious that Harvard, built on the profits of slavery, now lectures Africa about proper governance. The historical connection hit the auditorium like a lightning bolt leaving Professor Wittmann visibly shaken. Your institution's early benefactors traded human beings while writing treatises on liberty and justice, the moral foundation of Western academic superiority crumbled under Ibrahim's relentless truth-telling. Perhaps before suggesting where I should go, you should examine where your own authority comes from. The silence that followed was pregnant with the weight of centuries of unspoken truths. Even the cameras seemed to pause, capturing the moment. Western intellectual supremacy met its match. But I did not come here to prosecute the past, Ibrahim declared, his voice shifting from accusation to inspiration. I came to share the vision that is transforming Burkina Faso as we speak. He pulled out his phone, surprising the academic audience with this modern gesture during such a formal address. These are not statistics from your textbooks. These are real people, building real solutions. The screen showed images of solar farms stretching across the Sahel, schools filled with eager children, and hospitals serving rural communities. We have achieved food self-sufficiency in 3 years by trusting our farmers, not foreign consultants. The photograph spoke louder than any economic theory ever could. Professor Wittmann, you ask why I don't stay home and fix my country. Ibrahim's smile carried both warmth and steel as he addressed his critic directly. This is precisely what we're doing. Without permission, without aid dependency, without your approval, the auditorium erupted in spontaneous applause from the African attendees, their pride unmistakable. We have built indigenous pharmaceutical factories, reducing medicine costs by 70%. Each achievement he listed shattered another stereotype about African incompetence. Our youth unemployment has dropped to 15% through programs that teach technology alongside traditional skills. The success stories kept coming, each one a nail in the coffin of Wittmann's prejudices. We are not asking for charity or sympathy. We are demanding respect and partnership. Ibrahim's voice reached every corner of the hall, carrying the dignity of a continent rising. When your companies want our lithium for electric cars, they will negotiate with equals, not subjects. The declaration sent shockwaves through the business leaders present, realizing the old extractive models were ending. Our children learn coding and more, Fulfud and French, preserving culture while embracing innovation. The vision he painted was of an Africa confident in its identity yet engaged with the world. This is the leadership you claim we lack, building tomorrow while honoring yesterday. I invite you all to visit the Burkina Faso you think you know. Ibrahim concluded this section with open arms. Walk through our innovation hubs. Meet our entrepreneurs. Witness our democratic councils in action. The invitation was genuine, challenging them to replace assumptions with experience. See how we are solving problems your theories said were unsolvable. Professor Wittmann stood frozen, watching his worldview crumble in real time. Then, tell me if you still believe we need to go back home to learn governance. The gauntlet was thrown, not with anger, but with the quiet confidence of truth. The first person to stand was Dr. Amara Okafor, Nigeria's youngest Harvard PhD recipient. Her chair scraped against the floor as she rose, her applause echoing through the stunned auditorium. Within seconds, other African students and diplomats joined her, their clapping, growing stronger and more defiant. The sound rippled outward like a wave, reaching sympathetic professors and even some surprised Western attendees. Professor Wittmann watched in horror as his own audience turned against him. Ibrahim stood quietly at the podium, overwhelmed by the unexpected show of solidarity. Soon nearly half the auditorium was on their feet, applauding not just Ibrahim's words, but the courage to speak them. Dr. Chun, the summit coordinator, found herself clapping, despite her diplomatic training, warning against taking sides. Several Harvard students pulled out their phones, live streaming the historic moment to thousands of viewers worldwide. The applause lasted 3 full minutes each, seconds stripping away more Wittmann's academic authority. Even some European delegates rose, recognizing the truth in Ibrahim's challenge. The professor's face turned crimson as his intellectual supremacy crumbled before his eyes. Thank you, Ibrahim said simply, his voice cutting through the ovation with humble grace. The audience gradually returned to their seats, but the energy remained electric and expectant. I have used my 15 minutes not to attack, but to invite dialogue. His words carried the weight of someone who had just changed the conversation forever. Professor Wittmann remained standing beside him, trembling with rage and embarrassment. The cameras captured every nuance of this unprecedented moment in academic history. Ibrahim stepped away from the podium, his mission accomplished without raising his voice or losing his dignity. The standing ovation had transformed from polite academic applause into a revolutionary moment. Professor Wittmann's insult had backfired spectacularly, exposing his ignorance to the world. The auditorium buzzed with excited conversations as attendees processed what they had just witnessed. History had been made in Harvard's hallowed halls, and everyone present knew it. Within hours, clips of Ibrahim's response flooded social media platforms across 6 continents. Burkina Faso rising began trending worldwide as millions shared the moment. Western arrogance met African dignity. News channels from Al Jazeera to BBC scrambled to provide context for the viral confrontation. Harvard switchboard jammed with calls demanding Professor Wittmann's resignation from his position. African embassies reported unprecedented interest in cultural and economic partnerships. The 15-minute speech had ignited a global conversation about respect and equality. University campuses erupted in debates about colonial academic perspectives and modern African leadership. Students at Oxford, Span, and Cambridge organized solidarity events supporting Ibrahim's message. Professor Wittmann's book sales plummeted while demand for African scholarship skyrocketed overnight. Harvard faced mounting pressure to review its curriculum on African studies and governance. The academic establishment that had protected Wittmann's prejudices suddenly distanced itself from his views. Ibrahim had exposed the intellectual bankruptcy of Western superiority in one devastating speech. World leaders began reaching out to Burkina Faso for partnerships previously considered impossible. Investment inquiries poured in from unexpected sources seeking authentic development opportunities rather than extractive deals. The African Union praised Ibrahim's dignified response as a template for future diplomatic encounters. Stock markets reflected new confidence in African-led initiatives and sustainable development projects. Professor Wittmann announces early retirement, unable to recover from the public humiliation. The man who told Ibrahim to go back had inadvertently launched Africa forward 3 months later, Ibrahim addressed a united Nations General Assembly to thunderous applause. His Harvard moment had transformed him from regional leader to global voice of dignity. Applications to study in African universities increased by 300% as Western students sought authentic perspectives. The conversation had permanently shifted from charity to partnership, from aid to trade. Professor Wittmann's insult had backfired beyond his worst nightmares, awakening a sleeping giant. Africa would never again accept being lectured by those who refused to listen. Ibrahim Traoré's dignified response transformed a moment of humiliation into a global awakening about African leadership and Western academic arrogance. His 15-minute reply didn't just silence Professor Wittmann, it changed the conversation forever. What did you think of Ibrahim's powerful response? Subscribe for more inspiring stories of African leaders challenging the status quo.